Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like-minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but 2 of my last 3 trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The Amateur Traveler, episode 75. Today, the Amateur Traveler interviews the authors of Europe from a Backpack.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh no, 15-hour flight. Oh, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. The first piece of news I have today is a competition for geography knowledge for students who are at least 13 years of old in grades 9 through 12, public, private, and homeschooled. And the winner will receive a $20,000 college scholarship. What do you need to know? You need to know geography. Questions like, if you're driving due west from Dodge City, which state would you come to first? In what state is the world famous? Waimea Canyon? And what is the Loire Valley famous for? If you think you know someone who knows that, act now. This is something that is a time-sensitive thing. You need to take the online quiz portion of this by January 16th of 2007. And that's at aa.com/travel challenge. I'll put that link again in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. In a related story about the importance of the knowledge of geography, a 21-year-old German tourist who wanted to visit his girlfriend in Australian metropolis of Sydney landed 13,000 kilometers away in Sydney, Montana, after mistyping his destination on a flight booking website. Dressed for the Australian summer in t-shirt and shorts, he left Germany on Saturday for a 4-week holiday. Instead of arriving down under, he found himself on a different continent, bound for the chilly state of Montana. I did wonder, but didn't want to say anything, he told the Bild newspaper. I thought to myself, you can fly to Sydney via the United States? The hapless tourist, who had only a thin jacket to keep out the winter cold, spent 3 days in Billings Airport before he was able to buy a new ticket to Australia with 600 euros in cash that his parents and friends sent over from Germany. And in the final news story, Parisians are rude. A Paris tourism agency is ready to concede what many Americans and Britons have long contended: the French are rude. France's famed indifference towards outsiders is actually part of the country's charm and can be a market asset, says the Paris Île-de-France Tourism Office. The office has launched an online ad campaign called C'est so Paris, It's So Paris, designed to show foreign tourists how to cop the Parisian attitude. The campaign was put together to address concerns that the British, France's biggest source of tourism revenue, have begun to find the French so off-putting that they are visiting in fewer numbers. The campaign's English-language website shows British tourists how to decode and mimic the gestures of condescending waiters, indifferent taxi drivers, and pouting mademoiselles. It encouraged Britons to act French even if they can't speak a word of the language. As always, links to all these stories are on the website at amateurtraveler.com. And also, I should say, since I had thousands of new listeners, I assume you all had new iPods, and congratulations on that Christmas gift. If you do have an iPod, or if you're listening on iTunes, there is also an iTunes enhanced version of this show, which has both pictures in it as well as links directly to the articles that I'm talking about. I'd like to welcome on the show Mark Pearson and Martin Westerman, and they are the co-authors of 3 books, Europe from a Backpack, Italy from a Backpack, and Spain from a Backpack, which coincidentally we'll be talking about over the next half hour. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go out on a limb and say you're backpackers.
Yeah.
How did
Travelers more.
Travelers more. So where did the idea for the book come from, or the series of books come from? Europe, I think.
Chris,
you
this
said
is
was the
Mark.
first
Thanks
one.
again for having us on the show. You know, for us, it started when I was a student and I studied art history in Rome, which was basically a 3-month vacation. You know, class for us was going to the Sistine Chapel or the Colosseum. It was rough, let me tell you. And, you know, I spent the weekends backpacking around Italy, and, you know, I came back with a lot of stories and 2,200 digital photographs. And my friends and family, they didn't want to look through all 2,000 photographs. You know, they really just wanted, okay, tell me a good story or two from your trip. And that's when I came up with the idea to do a series called the Europe from a Backpack series books, and that is to go out and collect the best stories from young people backpacking in Europe. You know, because, you know, you get your guidebook and it tells you where to stay or how to get from one city to another, but it doesn't tell you what it's like to be there. You know, what's it like to run up the bulls in Pamplona, or to buy a leather jacket in Florence, or to have a beer at the Hofbrauhaus in Munich. So that's what I wanted to do, and I set out to tell the stories.
And what is it like to run with the bulls in Pamplona?
I don't think we'll ever know. We didn't do it ourselves. That's
Okay,
one of the
good.
nice things too. That's one of the nice things about getting other people to write stories about it. There's certain things you don't want to do out there that other people will do, and they'll write stories about it. And then you put them in the book, and it's as if you lived through it yourself, if it's a good story, which speaks to one of those questions you asked us earlier. How do we select the stories? We're looking for well-written, first-person, on-the-ground stuff that feels like you're right there with the author. And every one of these stories qualifies on that, on those criteria.
And my impression is, since, especially because of the style of travel we're talking about, I tend to think that your authors are mostly a younger crowd. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes.
And it depends on how you define young. You know, most of our authors are 20 and 30-somethings, and it's really not about age. It's more of a mode of travel, and that is traveling with a backpack. And some people have the misperception that it is, you know, hiking in the country. That's not what it's about. It's just we're referring to people who are traveling with a backpack on their shoulders, and that means they have the freedom where each day they can get up and decide what they're going to do and have just a sense of freedom.
Yeah, basically these are 20 or 30-something people who carry all their possessions on their backs, travel on a shoestring, and there are more than 2 million of them out there every year from North America, Europe, and England and the continent who are treading around, not necessarily planning ahead, mostly just going with the wind. And there weren't any books written for these people or by these people, and now we've got 3 of them that are.
So the first question I have for you is, you've had a lot of stories submitted. So I usually ask people, and I think I mentioned this to you, you know, your biggest highlight or your biggest surprise. Let's start with the second one. Of the stories you've seen, not your personal travel stories, we'll get to that in a minute. What was the biggest surprising story that somebody sent to you?
That's a good question.
Well, there are so many. You know, we've had more than 1,000 submissions, and now we have more than 120 that are told in these books. But one of my favorites, if you don't mind, let me tell you a little bit about it. It's called "We Were Going to Kill Each Other." And
I've been on that vacation.
Yeah, you know what it's like to travel with other people. Let me read the opening here. This is by Case Johnston. We were going to kill each other. Brandon wanted to kill Jason. Craig wanted to kill John. John wanted to kill Brandon. And I figure one or all of them wanted to kill me. We woke up tired this morning, just like every morning, because we never got enough sleep at night. Every night, a different bed, and every morning a train to catch. This morning, John was late. The morning before, it was me. We usually took turns being late, so things wouldn't get boring. In Berlin 2 weeks ago, John was late, and so we missed the train to Poland. Everyone wanted to kill John that morning. This morning, John was late again, and we almost missed the train to Interlaken, Switzerland. Thank God we didn't, or John wouldn't be with us now. In our separate and unique ways, we were annoying. None of us shared annoying traits. We all had a pattern on our own. John, as noted, was always late. He could not get out of bed, get into the shower, and get dressed in less than 45 minutes. He wouldn't wake up earlier than the rest of us. He would just promise that the next morning he would be faster. And the next morning it was the same. He never had a second gear. Brandon never showered, and he stunk. I would ask him why he rarely showered. He always stuck with the same answer. If I shower, then I can't sleep as long. So you can see that traveling, you either love them, people, or you hate people after you travel with them.
And for me, it was two things that surprised me. One was the variety of the stories that we got. One of the running with the bulls stories wasn't even about running with the bulls. This woman came to Pamplona to run with the bulls, and she and her girlfriend were walking along the sidewalk. She looked across the street and saw the guy of her dreams. Instantly, she fell in love with him. And the story was about falling in love and going back and marrying this guy. So the bulls were secondary, but she was there in Pamplona. Another one was taking a trek in northern Spain, and it changed her life. And the story was written so well that you could feel the change as she described it, treading along on tired, worn out, with this heavy backpack through this terrible weather. That one was, what's that one called? To be a Pilgrim. That's a terrific story. There are stories about partying in Ibiza and almost wrecking rental cars and sneaking into the Colosseum and shutting down the Vatican and finding true Christmas. A young woman who was just lonesome at Christmas time. She was a student in way over eastern Italy. She crossed the border into Slovenia and found picture postcard Christmas with sleigh bells and sleighs and snow and lights. And she couldn't believe that she'd come into this fairyland so far from home. So the variety and the depth of these stories really surprised me. And to top it off, just about everyone I read brought me back to traveling myself. It felt like I was right there on the ground. So they're just wonderful stories to read, and there's a whole book of them,
Now, I don't know if the books have been out long enough that you've had this experience yet, but have you gone to any of the places now drawn by the story of the person that you've put in the book?
Yes. But go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, and when we selected the stories, we wanted them to be familiar to people. So we have stories from the most popular cities. For example, in Italy, we have the big three, Venice, Florence, and Rome, and those are chapters in our book. And lately, Cinque Terre is a very popular spot amongst backpackers. Cinque Terre is a series of 5 coastal villages on the Italian Riviera that Rick Steves put on the map.
Right.
And we have 4 stories from Cinque Terre in our book.
So we've got people falling in love. We've got people on adventures. We've got just about, Europe from a backpack covers everything from England all the way out to Budapest, Hungary, and down to the south, down to Sicily and up north. How far up north do we go? Poland? Yeah, and northern Germany. And Italy and Spain are the 2 most traveled areas for backpackers. So we get a large quantity, a large percentage of stories submitted from those 2 places. So those are the next books.
Okay.
The ones that are out now.
How about your best personal travel stories? You've obviously got a love for travel here.
Well, let's see. One of my favorite travel stories was hiking with my buddy. This is back when I was a young guy. We just got out of the Coast Guard. I was stationed in England, and we hitchhiked all the way to Paris, we were walking around Paris, and he found a bottle of wine for 3 francs, which at the time was 75 cents, a bottle of red. He said, "Can you believe it? French wine for 3 francs?" And I said, "Yeah, don't drink that. if it's only 75 cents, it's going to." Well, it was really nasty stuff. So anyway, the next he drank it mostly. I tasted it and handed it back to him. And the next day, he was just flat on his back, sick in the hotel room. So it was an overcast day, and I thought, well, I really wanted to learn French, and I'd been taking French, but I wanted to learn really to speak it in the country. So I was wandering around, and I thought, I've been reading the Herald Tribune here, the International Herald Tribune, and at the time, they were typesetting it, and they were making lots and lots of typographical errors. So I thought, they probably need a proofreader for that newspaper, and I could do that as a job here, and that'd pay me enough to stay here so I could learn French. So I walked over to the Herald Tribune offices, up the stairs, banged on the editor's door. He opened it up, and I said, "Hey, I'm a graduate in journalism from the University of Oregon, and you need a proofreader, and I could do that, and I want to stay here and learn French." And he said, "Well, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Come on back on Monday." So I wandered on through Paris. I got back to the hotel room. My buddy recovered. We got up that morning, and he said, "Hey, let's go to Spain." So we just got on the train and took off. And I never did embark on being a great international journalist.
Oh.
Yeah, and I was recently in Madrid. I was only there for a day because I was going to catch a flight to Rome on one of the budget airlines. And so I stashed my backpack at the luggage locker at the Madrid train station. And so my friend and I, we went all around Madrid during the day, and we got back at night, and we had this bad feeling when, it was 11 o'clock, and the luggage place had closed for the night. So we go and get the security guard, and we explained our situation. He said, "Okay, I'll go back, and I'll open it up." And we go into our luggage locker, and you insert your paper ticket, and it didn't work. It got stuck in the machine, and so the door did not open. My backpack is stuck inside, and I had to get to the airport to catch my morning flight to Rome. So, and this was a miracle, we were able to convince security guard to call the head security officer of the train station to come in at 11:30 at night with his laptop to crack the system to open our backpack, to open the locker. And that's what they did. And so by 12:30, the guy had already come home for the night. He made a special trip out to the train station for us, and we were so grateful. And the rest of the night, I got to the airport at 1 in the morning. Or was just up all night and to catch the 7 in the morning flight. And so then you arrive in Rome on no sleep, but you're just grateful to be in Europe and happy you have your backpack.
Well, that actually reminds me, when you think of backpacking in Europe, I think most people think about a backpack, a Eurail pass, and staying in hostels or camping. You mentioned the discount airlines, and that have changed backpacking somewhat. What other changes are there now from my picture of getting around with a backpack in Europe, that style of travel?
Well, for the most part, it is still the same, apart from what you mentioned about the budget airlines. And another sort of recommendation I give people is to stay in, a budget hotel. It's often more economical than staying in a hostel. So that's a new change. And Rick Steves does a great job of singling out those budget hotels.
Another change that people point out in their stories is to stay in a hostel, you pretty much got to make a reservation. You got to plan ahead now. And so
right, that's a huge change.
You didn't have to plan ahead as much or reserve ahead as much when I was traveling there 30 years ago. It sort of dropped in. In fact, when I was there, you couldn't get peanut butter. You couldn't get, that's another story that is one of my favorites about Europe. At the time I was traveling there in the early 70s, when first traveling there, you couldn't get peanut butter. You couldn't get a chocolate chip cookie. You couldn't get a good hamburger. You couldn't get a good thick-cut French fry. There was no such thing as a milkshake. And I was stationed in England, and there was a little ratty place at Hyde Park Corner that a bunch of hippies had started. They'd decided they didn't want to go home, and they knew that Europe lacked all these important things that American and North American backpackers wanted. So they started this little place called the Hard Rock Cafe, and it was wooden benches and ceiling fans and Beach Boys and other 70s music. But they had good burgers and good milkshakes, and they were arguing with the British Health Department or Food Department at the time about hot fudge, the definition of root beer and the definition of hot fudge, because the U.S. definitions are different from the English definition. So anyway, we used to drop in there, and it was a great place to eat. And I got back from Europe and kind of forgot about the Hard Rock Cafe until I started seeing people wearing T-shirts like Hard Rock Tokyo and Hard Rock Madrid. And I said, what is that? There isn't any such thing as a Hard Rock Madrid. It's this little punky place on Hyde Park Corner in London. Well, it turned out they'd franchised it. They'd sold it out. They franchised, and they were now millionaires. And if only I'd stayed there and become a short order cook, I'd be rich too.
So that's 2 jobs you didn't take in Europe so far.
I can't tell you how many.
His whole life.
Sensing a trend here.
That's why he had to do the book, to relive all of his adventures.
A lot of good adventures I said yes to also. But,
what's the next book, by the way?
Well, right now we're focusing on these, the Italy, Spain, and the Europe, and on our website. We have so many people that want to share their stories now. They can sign up to be notified when the next books are due out.
I have people who listen who have stories, so if people do want to share their stories, how should they get in touch with you, and what is the right way to do that?
Yeah, they can simply go to europebackpack.com, and you can enter your email address, and we'll let you know when we need more stories.
The other question I had for you is, as you're going through this process, what was the highlight of the process for you? Clearly there's a lot of editing, there's a lot of real work involved, but what's the highlight of this whole thing?
The highlight is the stories themselves. Each time we would reread the stories, it brought back so many memories of our own travels. You read about the Trevi Fountain, and there's a story in our Italy book that just captures it, and it takes you right back there. Similar with Venice, you read about the canals and San Marco and the Piazza, and it's just like you're there, and you can remember your own trip and your experiences.
Yeah, again, I'm surprised at how well each of these stories evokes the place. There's so much power in story. As Mark said early on, that he'd taken all those slides, and people didn't want to sit down and watch slides. They wanted to hear the stories, because the stories are what bring the experience to life for them. People empathize, they sympathize, they feel it so much more when somebody describes it to them. It's interactive, it's exciting, and it's the feeling we got each time we read one of these stories.
You mentioned Cinque Terre and a region that sort of got discovered through guidebooks, in this case Rick Steves. Are there places that you have discovered through the stories of somebody submitted a story and you went, where the heck is that, and have since gone there and appreciated it?
Yeah. One of the things that our readers will pick up is sort of a style of travel, that you don't have to do a city a night, that it's okay to spend maybe, a week in one location. And so that's what readers will take away from this. Our goal was to focus on places that are popular, that most people go. But in our Europe from a Backpack, we have a section called Off the Beaten Path. And there are some locations in there that are off the beaten path. They're less traveled, and also some experiences. One fascinating story in the Spain book was a woman who decided to spend a week at a camp north of Madrid where wealthy Spaniards would go, and they would only speak English for the week. And so it was a way to really interact with the culture and to develop strong friendships with these Spaniards. And that was just something that I never thought of before.
Interesting.
And for me, there's certain stories I'm glad didn't write about places that I like, because I didn't want them discovered.
So you edited those out. I see. Okay.
Well, no, one of the drawbacks of travel writing is that there could be places you really like for their secluded nature or for the special cuisine they offer, just the atmosphere. And then they get discovered, and suddenly things change. And every now and then I check back, and nobody's writing about one of my favorites, Lagos, Portugal, which is down near the Algarve I hung out there for several days. There was a cafe right on the, well, it was on like a triangular block. It was beautiful brickwork sidewalks and plazas in Portugal and in this town as well. And there was a ring of tables out in the sun in front of the front door. And each day, as you came back, you'd be able to move up toward the front door because you'd been there a little longer and you were more familiar with people. And
Okay. Yeah.
and the old timers left. So by the time you get to the front door, you could get in there and you could get your peach nectar, your apricot nectar, just reach in and get it, you know. And I like that. I like being able to wander around town and know my place was next to the front door, you know, after 3 days there. Nobody's discovered Lagos, so I'm really pleased to see that. I can go back to Lagos. It'll be just about the same.
I once heard a tourist complaining in Venice about all the tourists, and looked over, and it was one of those people who was obviously an American and wearing his, you know, I'm here on a big bus tour name tag. And I'm thinking, well, yeah.
Well, one of those, you know, you don't know, but years ago I wrote a treatment for a pilot television series called Embassy, because I worked at the embassy, and in the intro material there'd be all these Americans who were sort of adrift traveling, and we'd have phrases like that, like, "Hey, why don't they take dollars here?" You know, and or "Where's my
That would
food?"
be
You
much
know, I
more
ordered
funny
5
if I hadn't
minutes
heard
ago.
people say that.
Yeah. And that it's kind of fun to watch that, but the people who are really adept at traveling, they tend to go off the beaten track. So those are the people that are fun to follow, because they don't travel to find the McDonald's to eat in or stay at the Holiday Inn or shop at Safeway. They travel to see the foreign place that they have gone to visit. And all these stories are about traveling to the foreign place you go to visit, not... in fact, it'd be an interesting story, wouldn't it, to write about going somewhere just to find all the American stuff that you can do, so you don't feel like you left home. I mean,
Now, the other advantage, obviously, of this style of travel that you're talking about is spontaneity. Any good stories about the benefits of spontaneity?
That's wonderful stuff.
Yeah, one of the lines I like is what makes backpackers and other travelers that backpackers travel with no suitcases or reservations. You know.
Yeah, the suitcase set is the. Those are the folks that make the reservations, rent the cars, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of virtue in that. You know, people have limited amounts of time. That's the other thing about the backpacker. Generally, they're open-ended about their time frame, or they've got a pretty long time frame that they can play with.
Any last...
And usually the spontaneity revolves around finding a place to sleep at night.
Yeah.
And there are several stories. And one of my friend, Caitlin Clausen, wrote a piece about her trip to Venice, and they decided not to fork out the several hundred euros for a hotel, and ended up sleeping outside at night, like kings and queens beneath a palace.
You'd asked about traveling without reservations. There's a woman named Lisa Cordaro in the Europe book who always wanted to live in Paris, and she was dragging her backpack around Paris late in the evening looking for somewhere to stay, and worse than that, she was out of money too. So she ends up at this hostel. One of them's closed, and they send her to the next one across town. She gets to that one, and there's a sign in the window that says, waitress wanted. So she's never waitressed before. She'd just gotten out of the Marines, but she decided she could waitress. And she went in and said she'd take the job, and they said, fine, you get a room upstairs, and you waitress. So she got the room and a job all at once, and the tips that she made from there enabled her to travel out of Paris. So, and that serendipitous delivery is always there for people who travel, and just kind of let go and say, okay, I'm out here.
Any last final words of advice for someone who is planning this kind of trip?
Trust serendipity. If anything, each of these stories indicates that good things are going to happen no matter where you go. Things will turn out right, and trust the force, because it's with you.
what comes out of these stories is just a desire to travel, to see the world. And the thing about Europe is once you've been there, you got to get back. And that's what these stories do, is they make you want to go online and book your next flight to Europe.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, and we'll put links, obviously, in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com, but once again, europebackpack.com. And our guests again, Mark and Martin, thank you very much for being here.
Great.
Welcome.
Thanks so much
for inviting us.
After we stopped recording, I told Mark and Martin I was planning on buying a copy of the book because I thought it sounded very good. They generously sent me a copy of all 3 books, and both my wife and I have been reading them and really enjoying them. They're really very well-written books, and I think you will enjoy them also. And if you missed those links, they'll be in either the iTunes enhanced version or on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I have 2 resources for you in the internet portion of the show. The first one is kayak.com, which I've mentioned before as one of my favorite places to find travel deals. Also just added cruises, so you can look for cruises through there that will search many other sites. Basically, they are a portal that will search a number of different travel sites. Similarly, pricegrabber.com also just added a travel tab so that you can search through PriceGrabber, which happens to be a site that I like for searching for consumer electronics, so you might want to check that out for travel also. If you listened to the show last week, you know that I have a contest. If you write a review in iTunes and send me an email, I'll draw a name at random at the end of February and send somebody an Amateur Traveler mug. I didn't say why I wanted people to do that. Basically, the podcasts that have more reviews can move up into the featured podcasts where more people can see it. And basically, if I had about 10 more reviews, the Amateur Traveler would probably be featured at this time, so that would be helpful to me. Another thing that I'm doing to promote the show to get more hits from search engines is I'm thinking about adding blogging. That is, in between podcasts, to add in some travel articles. I've been doing this for Adam Christensen at the MacCast, and it seems to have helped out there. So I'm looking for maybe half a dozen people who like to write about travel, who might be interested in doing that, and then we can talk about what the payoff would be for you. I'm not really sure yet. I'm interested in some ideas. I've started a thread over in the ideas section on the Amateur Traveler discussion boards. And speaking of the discussion boards, Huang from Milpitas wrote a great summary of resources on southern Alaska. If you're interested in traveling there, check out the link that I'll put in the show notes or in the iTunes enhanced version for that particular discussion that has a list of a whole bunch of links you might be interested in, including weather and natural parks and those sorts of things for southern Alaska. Amy from Mountain View wrote and noted that when I talked about the Big Island of Hawaii back in the summer, I didn't mention hotels that we had stayed at, even though I said we'd had good experiences with hotels, so I put some information about that also on the discussion board, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes again at amateurtraveler.com. Howard Shepard from the Word Nerds wrote back after listening to the episode that he was on. He also said he listened to this morning to the show about the 2 high school boys who biked the West Coast. Really a great story. 6 years ago, I did a similar ride, he says, organized by the American Lung Association from Seattle to Washington, D.C. The kid's story brought back lots of memories. Howard's trip was 3,250 miles about, but at least it was a supported ride. They didn't have to carry their tent or food, but still sounds like quite an adventure. And Howard, I'm glad you're enjoying the podcast. And with that, I think we'll bring this show to a close. Next week's show should be on Vietnam. I recorded that this morning. Should be an interesting story. Again, if you don't want to miss any episodes of The Amateur Traveler, then you're welcome to subscribe to it. Subscriptions are free, especially easy if you're using iTunes, but you can subscribe with any podcatcher client. If you have any questions at all about that or anything else or suggestions for the show, send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. I'm fairly prompt in returning my email and love to hear from you. Again, check out the discussion boards, leave a review on iTunes, and as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest, served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery. Podshow and Limelight.